Dear listeners of the Nerdwelten Podcast, this episode is something very special, as it is not in German as usual, but entirely in English. As part of our Zak Mc Kracken episode, I had a very enjoyable conversation with the game's lead designer, Mr. David Fox, which you are now about to hear. Please remember to check and like our Facebook page, and you can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube. So without further ado, let's get started. Herzlich willkommen beim Nerdwelten Podcast. Hier wollen wir uns über all die schönen nerdigen Dinge dieser Welt und insbesondere über Retro-Videospiele und Computerspiele unterhalten. Also macht's euch bequem, spitzt die Ohren und dann viel Spaß mit der heutigen Folge. Dear listeners of the Nerdwelten Podcast, today it is my great pleasure to have Mr. David Fox himself as my guest. Welcome to the show, David.
Hey, hiya.
David, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your time at Lucasfilm Games and in particular about Zak Mc Kracken. So, what was your focus after Maniac Mansion? Where did your input for Zak Mc Kracken and the Alien Mindbenders come from?
Well, I knew that I wanted to do my own graphic adventure. I spent, about maybe 6 months or so working on Maniac Mansion and really enjoyed the experience working with Ron and Gary, but it was their game. I know I made a lot of contributions, and one of the best parts was I got to learn the SCUM system, and I said, okay, wow, I could do my own adventure. I now know how to do this, but I don't want to be confined to a mansion. So what's the opposite of being confined? I wanted something that was visiting lots of different locations, and I also knew that ahead of time that I wanted something that was kind of a new age comedy game. And I didn't have a clear story yet. So Steve Arnold, who was our general manager at the time, had a good friend named David Spangler who lived up in the Seattle area in Washington State. And David is a writer, or was a writer, I guess he still is, and a spiritualist. And a lot of what he's written about is stuff like that, about spiritualism. But he also had a good sense of humor. And I went up for a couple of days and brainstormed with him and just came up with this exhaustive list of locations and stories that, are kind of going back to the first UFO landing, which happened to be in his neighborhood on Mount Rainier, or at least the first UFO sighting, I mean. And he introduced me to the idea, the stories about the face on Mars. I hadn't heard about that before. And we just kind of brainstormed, coming up with kind of a rough general idea of the locations and the types of things we might want to include, like teleportation and mind linking and things like that. I have no idea where these ideas came from. I don't remember. I don't have my notes still, or I couldn't find them. So I don't remember what the origin was, but it was up to me to go back and spend time to take all that content and put it into an actual cohesive game. So I took about maybe 2 or 3 months after our meeting and came up with a design doc and kind of laid out the main plot points and the story and the overall story and everything. So that was the origin of the whole thing. I think the character's name was Jason, and he was a reporter, but he wasn't a reporter for like a crappy tabloid newspaper. Uh-huh. Just like a mainstream media reporter.
And when did you change the name from Jason or whatever it was to Zak Mc Kracken?
Well, I passed, as we did a lot, we shared our designs with the other game designers at Lucasfilm Games and passed it around. And Ron Gilbert thought that what could have been funnier, that it wasn't wacky enough, that I should kick that up. So we ended up doing a brainstorming session with all the designers, and Steve Arnold kind of ran it. And we kind of gave the whole thing like a little shift in the wacky direction. Nothing really changed in terms of the plots and locations and all that. Just by making him a tabloid reporter, where you're basically making up stories, that gave us the ability to have really crazy stories. And him coming up with the headlines, I think that was my idea. constantly coming up with really crazy headlines because that's what catches your eye when you see these at a supermarket, at a grocery store. You see them at the checkout counter, and it's always the headlines that grab you and make you try to want to open it. We used a Marin County phone book and just randomly went through looking for some names, and Zak was one name and McCracken was another name. We put them together. We talked about the name of the game then, because you talked about what the aliens were doing to you, and so how about they're Mindbenders? Okay, they're Alien Mindbenders. Okay, how about Zak Mc Kracken and the Alien Mindbenders? And so the title came from that meeting too. It's interesting because when I went back, a few months later and looked at my original design document and compared it to where the game ended up being, everything in the design document was actually there. It just wasn't as wacky. I didn't go in the silly direction as much as in my first one. It was definitely supposed to be funny, but maybe more dry humor, not as out there.
Mm-hmm. As I said, you had a lot of wacky ideas. Who came up with the whole "let's dress out a stewardess" idea? Was there a real life situation with an irritating stewardess, or was it just completely made up?
Well, that was mine, I'm sure.
Okay.
I think that was probably in the design doc. The truth is, the design doc was probably more of an overview and not specific. For sure, there was no dialogue. It was more like, okay, we need to get this. We have to get this from the plane. And then maybe when I was coding it, I said, okay, well, I need some way to stop you from doing this stuff. Okay, the stewardess is going to be nasty. And I've definitely had a number of experiences back then where, flight attendants were just a little snitty and too officious. And there were some that were really nice, but this was my opportunity to kind of get back at every insult and get back in your seat kind of comment that I ever heard on an airplane.
As I said before, you wanted to make your adventure more global. I know you like traveling and you like hiking. Did you visit some of the scenes of the game as part of Lucasfilm games or later in your life?
Well, I've been to Seattle, so the Seattle airport. Most of the others, probably not. I've been to the Miami airport, but never been up in a biplane. I have not been to Stonehenge yet. And I've definitely not been to Mars. So probably most of them not. We did a lot of research. We were at the time we did the game. We were still based at Skywalker Ranch, and there's an amazing library there, actual real working library for the use of the company. It's a research library, so they have lots of picture books, lots of resources, so that when someone's making a movie and they want to see, what does Peru look like or something, they just go there and the librarians will pull out all the books for you, come back, a day later, and there's this, 2-foot tall stack of picture books with places marked in them. And we use that a lot for the look and feel of some of the locations. Egypt, I've not been to Egypt. And I've not been to Nepal so probably most of the places in the game I've only been able to visit in the game so far. Although it'd be nice to go there. I've been to England a bunch of times, but never made it to Stonehenge. So unfortunately now I understand that you can't even make it up to the stones. I think there's a barrier. Yeah. So and I don't know if they removed the altar that was there in the game. So it was a blend of imagination and reality. I mean, the fact that we put the game years in the future meant that we didn't have to be totally accurate, because we could say, well, this isn't how it is today when the game came out, but maybe when the game takes place, this area or location has changed, and that's how it looks now. Mm-hmm. So,
what is your funniest memory about Zak Mc Kracken?
I'm not sure. I remember when we came up with the disguises of the aliens. I think I probably worked with Gary Winnick on that. Like, how can we come up with a really good disguise? And coming up with the Groucho glasses and the hats with holes, and that was a lot of fun. Early on in the game, after I finished the design, I started implementing it. I knew that this was going to be pretty massive for me to do by myself, and it's also not really fun to do a game by yourself, at least not for me. So I asked if we could bring on someone else to help with coding, and Matthew Kane was already in the company, but he was doing some work more in audio and video disc production in the learning group. And we knew each other, but not really well, but he just seemed like a great match. So he came over, we brought him up to speed on Scum. And as a result, we had a lot of fun writing a scene and then sharing it with the other person. And that person would always be the first one to be able to laugh at something. So I think he probably did a lot of the Elvis dialogue and, came up with some of the words, like probably Glorific was probably his. So I don't remember a specific, like, oh my God, that's really hilarious. It was more kind of going back and forth. I had a lot of fun with Pirate Jail. I'm sure that was me that wrote that whole thing. We had to, having been burned early with piracy, with our first two games getting released, even before they were published. And we knew we had to do something to add some copy protection. We knew that the disk protection would get cracked pretty early. And the idea back then was, well, okay, you add content into the box, which would be harder to duplicate and would also include some copy protection stuff. So there was the newsletter, or I guess it was a newspaper that I actually didn't get to work on. We hired someone outside who went through the game and gave him all the plot points and came up with a great way to integrate a bunch of the puzzles with hints to help you with that. So having that kind of acted like not like a hint book, but maybe push you in the right direction. And then we had the much hated security code system, the Visa security code system, where every time you left the country at an airport, you had to punch in for codes, for symbols that were printed on a dark red piece of, little booklet that was just really hard to read and supposedly close to impossible to photocopy, although people figured out how to do it. And if you entered the wrong code several times in a row, it was 3 or 5, I can't remember now, you get thrown into pirate jail and get lectured about copy protection and piracy by the guard. And that was, like the stewardess, the flight attendant, that was my way of kind of letting my frustration at people trying to rip off our stuff kind of come out. So it was done with humor, but it was also, there's some serious emotion behind it too. But, it was kind of a fun Easter egg to have that. Oh, the other Easter egg was, which I thought was really funny. This is probably, I don't know how funny I think it is now, but I was a lot younger back then, was that there was the Easter egg with mind linking with the yak.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I should give it away here if people haven't played the game, but
yeah, of course,
I'll let you. Okay, well, with the various animals that you could mind link with in the game, and some of them were critical to gameplay and some weren't. And in the case of the yak, there really wasn't anything needed to do that other than just kind of being a joke. And I think we gave you one verb. We changed the verb interface for each animal. So with the yak, it became chew. And after 20 chews or some random number in there, you get another verb that would pop up, which was like poop or something like that. I think it was probably poop. Yeah. And he would do it, and then Zach would wake up and get disgusted and walk away. And it was just, it was one of those things that was just, it was, in some ways, it was the microwave hamster moment that I had in that game. So I had to share it with people. I was responsible for that too, by the way. And it was just kind of this little slightly off joke that I thought was kind of fun.
Okay, but now if you say you are responsible for the hamster in a microwave, I would like to get another explanation from you.
Okay, on that one?
Yeah, please.
Well, let's see, what was it? Well, I mean, we had a hamster and we had a microwave. And I said, gee, what happens if you try putting it in a microwave? And so I asked Gary for art so we could do that. And I said, oh, well, what happens if you actually turn it on? And so I asked him for the art, for like a blood splat on the version of the microwave door. And I wired it all up, and then I had Ron come in and had him do it without telling him what was going to happen. And he laughed. He thought it was really sick. And we decided that this was something that only a couple of the kids would be willing to do, and most of them would refuse. I don't know if they refused to put it in, but they would definitely refuse to turn it on. And it was just, and then that out of that came like, what happens if you pick up the remains and you give the remains to Weird Ed, and if you do, then that's one of the ways that your kid could die, because he gets really outraged and you die. So that game there was death, but most of the deaths were like pretty obvious. So this is going to, like, don't throw this switch or don't do that, and it would happen. So that was fun.
Back in the day, you were always in tight competition with Sierra. As far as I understand, the Sierra games were perhaps even more successful than the Lucasfilm titles in the US. But in Europe, and especially here in Germany, the very accessible SCUM engine and great translations, of course, made your games more successful. Especially Zak Mc Kracken stands very high in many German gamers' regards. What may be the reason for this, in your opinion? So
the reason for why Zak is in great regard in Germany, or that Sierra didn't make it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, well, let me do both. Okay, so Sierra had a huge head start. They were doing adventure games and graphic adventure games, years before Lucasfilm Games was born. I remember playing an early version of I guess you could call it's still a text adventure with like imagery on an Apple II, like maybe late 70s, 79, 80, somewhere around there. And they were based in the US. I don't think they had distribution in Europe, at least not much. If they did it, I don't know that they did translations. And maybe it was harder to translate their games because it wasn't just translating the text. You also had to put all the intelligence in the parser to translate that in a way which worked. So it's probably a more difficult task than for us. We just had to translate a bunch of verbs, and those didn't change a whole lot, plus the text. But for whatever reason, whenever they came out with a new game, it would sell 10 times more, as far as we knew, than our games would become an instant hit. And it was kind of frustrating. So we felt like there was this competition, but it was more us competing with them as opposed to them competing with us, as far as I know. I mean, maybe they did, but it definitely felt like it was one-sided. But in Europe, we had this great marketing guy, Doug Glenn, who thought that we could do a really good job with getting our games distributed in Europe. And I think he partnered with Activision, maybe some other companies, to take care of distribution there. Some of the games we translated in-house. Eventually, I think maybe the early ones we would work with people, specific people in the industry. I know Boris Schneider did the German translations for most of the games, right. At least the ones I was involved in. And as a result, we ended up with much better penetration. Although I get a lot of people still coming up to me and say, I learned English from playing your games. Either it was a language that we didn't translate for, was their native language, or in a lot of cases, I mean, people from East Germany who could not get distribution of the games would end up, the easiest one to get might have been a pirated version of the English version of it. So, there are a lot of people who were so motivated to figure out how to complete the game that they learned a whole new language as a result. And I still get that. People, whenever I go to a conference or something, someone will come up and say, hey, I learned English because of playing whatever game you did, which was kind of fun. So but there's another question, which is why does Zak seem to have this connection in Germany? Yes, and why, there were a bunch of fan created sequels that were made. They were all made in either Germany or Austria. And the only thing I could guess is there's something in the humor that just resonated with people from Germany. I don't know if that's true. You'd have to tell me that because it always, I was always kind of wondering, like, why, how come all these games are coming out from Germany? All these, I don't know that people are still doing that, but they were definitely doing a lot in the 90s, where you'd see these sequels come out, 90s and maybe early 2000s. And it was, kind of an honor to have people love the environment and the characters so much that they wanted to spend often years, because it was all volunteer efforts, working on this in order to be able to produce something in that environment. And, it was kind of a puzzle. I don't know. Why do you think? I should turn it around and see if you have an idea.
Okay. First of all, it's the designs of the game. As you said, as a non-native English speaker, the SCAM system made it very accessible. It made me learn English as well, as you've said before. And yeah, it just was the humor on one hand, then the visuals on the other hand. I played Zak Mc Kracken, the PC version. Later I had a disc magazine, a budget version of the game, came out in 94 when Zak Mc Kracken was already 5 years old. But I was really, really into this Lucasfilm, LucasArts adventures. They always were fun. You couldn't die. This was a factor as well. And as you said before, the Sierra games were never translated in German because it was too difficult and the parser system just didn't work for me.
Okay, well, so that might be it. We filled maybe our games across the board just filled this hole that wasn't already filled by Sierra, where in the United States, we definitely had fans in the US too, but I don't think we ever built up as big a following here as in Europe. And looking at Thimbleweed Park, Ron, and for those who don't know, that was a game that kind of brought the old band back together again. Ron and Gary came up with this concept to do a graphic adventure game in the style of the ones that we did in the late 80s and early 90s, and did a Kickstarter, and that was successful, and invited me on. And Mark Ferrari, who's one of our artists back then, was one of the primary artists on this. And when we looked at the locations of where people were from, I'd say Germany was probably the largest population outside of the U.S. And so the same fans followed us to do this game. And of course, we did the translation initially. It got launched with, I think, the main 4 translations, plus we did Russia like a month later. So French, Italian, German, and Spanish. It came out with the game, but only for subtitles. All the voice was all recorded only in English. Yep. Anyway, so that's still the case. So we still have that same base. It's still there.
Okay, and now that you've mentioned Thimbleweed Park, that was a question I wanted to ask later, and also had the bringing the band back together phrase in it. So what are your thoughts about the bringing the band back together moment for Thimbleweed Park? Yeah,
what were your thoughts about the whole project?
About the whole project and how it was received with the audience. Because as I read on Ron Gilbert's Grumpy Gamer site, between the lines you can read that he wasn't too satisfied with the sales.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what his expectations were. As far as I know, this was probably one of the biggest games I worked on in terms of sales, at least in recent times. I'm pretty happy, but I didn't have to do anywhere as much work on the game as Ron did. Ron and Gary were working on it for like at least 3 or 6 months before I popped on, which was coming up with the design, doing the whole Kickstarter, getting all that in place. And they're the ones that took the huge risk, because if you go out there and do a Kickstarter and it fails, which happens, then there's a huge hit. I think there's a huge hit to your reputation. And so that, it's a big, I don't think I'd ever do it. I don't have the same following that Ron does either, because I kind of popped out of gaming maybe in the early 90s, where he stayed on through the entire last couple of decades. And when I did get to take a look at a couple early versions of the Kickstarter pages before they launched it and gave feedback and, encouraged him, told him at one point, if it happens that you get enough funding to bring on other people, I'd love to work on it with you guys. So he knew that. And there was a point where I think they blew through the initial goal and hit another couple milestones. And that's when he announced that both myself and Mark Ferrari would be joining the team because he didn't have enough of a budget to expand it. And I remember that at our first brainstorming meeting, it was me and Ron and Gary, and it was like for, I think, 2 days we were meeting to kind of go through the basic design layout and then just really flesh it out and come up with this specific puzzles and a bunch of the other parts. I was a little worried. It had been like 25 years since I had worked with them, and I didn't know whether it would click, whether I still had it in terms of being able to come up with ideas. And, it took about 5 minutes before everything just said, oh yeah, hey, I remember this. And we just kind of jumped right back into the same roles we had way back. And I felt really comfortable. It was really fun. And it was probably one of the most fun projects I worked on. The whole team, I mean, not just these people, but, Jen, various writers we've had, Lauren and Robert, who I knew before, who was in charge of playtesting, and we had some awesome testers, Octavie, who did a lot of the animation and some of the background art. It was a first class team, and we used Slack as a way to stay in touch, and so there was generally someone awake somewhere in the world working on the project at all hours. So you could be working late and put a message out there and get immediate responses back. And it was just, it was really fun. So I would do it again if it ever happened. I'm not sure what kind of game it would look like, but I think maybe in Ron's case, you can do a game and it could be successfully and really, really well received, but maybe not successful enough to launch a company maybe, or let you do a whole bunch, completely fund a series of future games. Mm-hmm. And so I think it kind of hit that part where it, definitely made its money back. It was widely well received, and I know they got money for it, but I don't know whether it was as much as he was hoping for. So I don't have numbers, so I don't know exactly, but I'm totally happy with the project.
Yes, I loved it very much.
Good.
Okay, back to Zak Mc Kracken. I read a lot of stories that you and the other programmers put your wives and girlfriends in the game, and you have confirmed this in other interviews before. But one thing that came to my mind is how much David is in the character of Zak, or the other way around, how much Zak is in David.
That's a good question. I don't remember thinking, okay, here's a character I have to wrap my mind around in order to write the lines and everything. So I think it was probably felt pretty comfortable just writing from my own point of view. I like the concept of an adventure game in that you can be really creative with solutions to do things. And I think in real life, I do that too. So I don't know which came first. I actually remember doing projects as a kid where I was pretty inventive on putting things together to make like little invention things. So that part kind of matched where you had a character who has to come up with strange combinations of things to solve things, and that fits my personality. Humor was probably mine. Probably not quite as punny as Zak, so I had to push that part. And Matthew did a great job of matching whatever tone I had set with the characters and just writing in that point of view. So, I guess he ended up being kind of a hybrid of both of us. Actually, I probably did more of the cutscenes, but he wired a bunch of the rooms. And when when you wire up a room for the first time, one of the things you're doing is adding comments or reactions to objects that maybe don't have a gameplay related purpose. So like a poster on a wall or, a rock or objects and stuff like that. So that's coming from the person who wrote those. I named Annie after my wife. Her maiden name was Annie Laris. Melissa was named after Ron's girlfriend, who was, I think, getting a master's or doctorate in China studies. So that's why her name ended up being Melissa China. And Leslie was Matt's girlfriend at the time. And she had a kind of, she was also one of our play testers on the game, as a paid play tester. So she'd come in and we'd notice like every week or two she'd have dyed her hair a different color.
Okay.
And, like really bright colors. And so that's where that joke came from, where every time you take off her helmet in Mars, her hair has a different color.
That's really sweet.
And I think those were the main ones. I don't know if anyone else in the game was really based off of people we knew. Not that I remember. It was just, characters we came up with. And for that, even for that matter, I don't really, there wasn't any connection with, writing lines for Melissa or Leslie that were based on their personalities. It was more just naming them as a kind of a compliment to our people, to our girlfriends.
Okay.
My wife.
As you've mentioned before, there are some pretty good fan-made sequels to Zak Mc Kracken, but were there ever plans for an official second part?
There wasn't ever one while I was there, and since I kind of left Lucasfilm Games right around 1990. Well, I was there for 8 years and then 2 years doing another project at Lucasfilm. Mm-hmm. And usually when a sequel happens, the original creator of the IP would be the main designer on that, at least for the first ones. And who knows, if I had stayed at Games and not done the other project, maybe there would have been one that I would have pushed for. But I don't know that anyone else was as enamored. Also, I don't know whether Zach had the same, whether we thought it was as popular as some of the other games. It's one of those things where it had this long staying power that I don't know the company was aware of. So when they did, like, what should we do another game on? Of course, soon after that we did, Ron did Monkey Island. That became like a much bigger franchise in terms of popularity. And I think that's where the focus was. There was supposed to be a couple sequels to Loom, but Brian left, and I think that kind of fizzled. And then there was a point where, also soon after I left, where Star Wars became a much bigger focus for LucasArts. And I think I've mentioned this before in interviews, that during the time I was actually there during the 80s, we weren't allowed to do Star Wars games because they were all licensed out to other companies. And then maybe after the movies had all come out and there wasn't as much clamor for other companies to license Star Wars games, they decided, and maybe they also believed that we could actually pull it off, because we did a really good job with the Indiana Jones license, that became more of a focus. And I think, from what I've heard from people, is that it may be too much of a focus, that they kind of started killing off a bunch of the more independently created IP over the 90s and definitely in the 2000s. And then there was a point in the early 2000 where they killed a bunch of games that were good venture games that were in progress, and just decided that they wouldn't do them anymore. And I think part of it was maybe the increasing cost. Each one had more animation and more production costs and took longer, whereas the audience wasn't growing comparatively. So in terms of return on investment, I think they just made a business decision that it didn't make sense to put money into that when they could be putting money into something which had a better chance of returning a certain amount. So it got to be much more of a business, I think, than when I was there. When I was there, it still had a researchy kind of feel, experimental feel. And it wasn't it wasn't marketing driven in the same way that I think it became later.
Okay, but perhaps if you're doing your own Kickstarter project, that would be an idea.
Well, I don't own the rights, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, Disney owns it. And I mean, it was nice enough that they were willing to release all the old Scum games onto GOG and some on Steam. So at least people can play them legally and get versions for the current platforms. But I don't think it's too likely. It's also old enough that there was a thing where there were a series of games where they did updated versions, extended versions, or current, what's the word for that? So they did high quality, high def, redid the art, redid the sound, and the more recent the game, the easier it is to do that because they already had voice or they could do that. So Zak is so ancient that I think to upgrade it would be really difficult. If you did it gave it a Thimbleweed Park treatment and just upgraded, added voice and everything, then that might be easier. But I still think there's a huge demand. And to talk to Disney, you have to have pretty deep pockets to even approach them for something. So I have fond memories of the whole thing, but I think my focus has kind of moved on also. Okay. So.
You've mentioned Indiana Jones: The Last Crusade, the graphic adventure. How was the work process compared to your previous games? As here, you had an already fixed movie plot to follow.
True. And we had very limited time. This year is the 30th anniversary of Indiana Jones and Last Crusade. And I've been thinking about it a lot because of that. We've been kind of, myself and Noah mostly been talking about it, and Noah Faustine. And, Noah was the original project leader on the game, and he was on it for maybe a couple of months and realized that there was no way he could do this on his own and get it out in time for the movie. So both Ron and I joined the project. We kind of became equal project leaders and kind of split up the game into different parts. And I think that was around December of that year. And then the game came out around July. I think the movie came out maybe a couple months before the game did. And it was another really good project. It was really great collaboration. We had a lot of fun. We did have the script, but we knew that we didn't want to make the game totally match the script. We also didn't want you to have seen the movie in order to finish the game or complete the game. And we also didn't want someone who saw or didn't see the movie to have an advantage or disadvantage. So we had an early meeting with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, an informal meeting. We were just, hanging around a couple of couches in our foyer area of the Skywalker Ranch. And I think there was probably a fire going in the fireplace, and it was very cozy. And I asked them a couple of questions like, can we kill Indy? How close do we have to stick to the script? Can we add additional locations we wanted to? And they basically said, sure, go for it. Do anything you want. You can kill Indy. And then Steven started talking about this whole subplot that you could add in South America and all these things, which we said, no, wait. We don't want to add too much extra because we have a very limited time. We just want to make sure we have the freedom to do that if we want to. There were sections of the movie which we just said, okay, this is not tied that importantly to the plot. So the whole opening sequence with young Indy, we played homage to it with the opening credits on the circus train, but that's it. The whole next opening sequence with Indy trying to get the cross of Coronado on the boat and falling into the water and the boat exploding, and that whole thing was kind of fun, but it also didn't seem like it was it would fit in with the adventure game. We didn't want to do all these effects for that. So I had this joke in the beginning where Indy walks in dripping wet, and when Brody walks into the school with water dripping off of him, and when Brody says, "Why are you all wet?" and he says, "Don't ask," looks at the camera. And, so that was our reference to that opening sequence. I just got to do a rewatch of the movie for the first time in a couple of decades. My son has a podcast called Read It and Weep, and he does with a bunch of his friends, and they do reviews of movies and books, and there was a request to do a rewatch of this film to see whether it holds up. And it was really fun to go back and watch it again and see, what things are totally good and which things were kind of, made me uncomfortable because maybe it was great for 1989, but, 30 years later, it's just like, oh no, and there were a couple of those things. But overall, it was still really a fun watch. And also remembering a bunch of the stuff from the game that was, where we got it from the movie and various lines. It belongs in a museum, or a couple other lines that were there. Talking about going to locations, I was in Italy in September of this last year, and I got to go to the church where which is a library in the movie, where the piazza and that whole part in Venice, and that was really fun. So I took got a picture taken of me there, and so there was an instance where I did get to visit a location that was in a game I did. So I think we did a pretty good job of balancing it. We had a couple of scenes, at least one scene that I know of that was in the original script that got cut in the movie. And that was there's a whole thing with a radio operator in the Zeppelin that we have in the game, but that got cut off. There's a line in the movie that made no sense because it was referring to that cut scene. I think the line is, as he's kind of going into the underbelly of the Zeppelin, it says, "I thought it would take them a lot longer to figure out the radio was dead." And in the movie, I think in the script, I think he disables it, breaks the radio, knocks out the radio operator, and puts on his clothing. That's where he's wearing this white jacket, and all that got cut and makes no sense in the movie when you hear that without that previous scene. But we have a whole thing in the game with that. So when we saw that it got cut, it was kind of like, oh no. But it was okay because it fit really well. Yeah, there's a whole sequence. I've told this story before, but it's kind of fun where so Ron had given me some dialogue to add to the end game sequence where you have the right Grail cup, and you have to and what happens if you choose to have basically your choice is what you do with the cup and everything. And he gave me some dialogue which was pretty funny. It was kind of irreverent and kind of tongue in cheek. And then Noah gave me some dialogue which was much closer to the actual script from the movie. And we had a meeting about me putting in Noah's dialogue, thinking that Ron's was placeholder. And he said, no, that wasn't placeholder. That was intended to be the dialogue. So we kind of messed up by having two people working on the same thing. And then we had this intense discussion trying to figure out which version we should use. And my solution was to use both and just use random number generator to flip between the two versions. And so when you play it a couple of times, you'll see that some of the dialogue changes, where some of it is funnier, more irreverent, and some of it is more closely matched to the movie. So we have a few things like that where we had to, got together and came up with good solutions to work out, good compromise solutions. Mm-hmm. But overall, it was a really fun project to work on. We didn't make the deadline. I think we hit, like I said, I think we came out we finished a couple months after the movie launched, but we figured it wasn't terrible because the movie would have, long legs. It'd still be in the theaters 6 months later. And so, it would have been better to have them both release on the same day, but, that wasn't likely to happen. That would have given us 5 months or 6 months of development. And it was just too short.
What are your fondest memories about your time with Lucasfilm games?
There's so many. There is one that, there are all these great company-wide events. Like they would do an annual 4th of July picnic at Skywalker Ranch where maybe 1,000 people were there, and they'd have barbecue and have ice cream trucks and, competitive sports in Lake Miwok, I think it was Lake Ewok, and they had, Miwok is an Indian tribe that's native to California, a Native American tribe that was here, before anyone else came here. And Ewoks were what the Ewoks are from the Jedi. Mm. So those are always fun. I remember we had this guy, Charlie Kellner, who was one of our early people, worked with me on Rescue on Fractalist, and then he did the Eidolon. He loved remote control cars, and he ended up doing this hack where he mounted a camera, like really miniature camera, on top of a remote control car, and then had it send its video signal to a converted sit-down arcade game station, like one of those arcades with a steering wheel.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
So you could control the car with the steering wheel, and the video from the car would be on the screen. So it's like you were driving through a miniature environment. And we were doing this. It was in the summertime, and it was in this courtyard area that was part of our building. Kind of roughly, it was called the Stable House, and it was supposed to look like it had been a converted horse stable. So the wood was really rough. The ground was cobblestones, and it had a kind of rustic feel to it. And so he's driving around the courtyard, and all of a sudden there's this lizard there in front of him. And he started chasing the lizard around the courtyard. The lizard keeps, and when you see it from within the car point of view, you see this, giant lizard looking back at you every once in a while, and like, "Are you so chasing me? Are you so chasing me?" And he was kind of going around in circles. That was pretty hilarious, although it wasn't very nice for the lizard, I'm sure. Okay, that's a good story. I'll stop with that.
Yeah, it is, definitely.
Okay.
David, where do you see the genre of point-and-click adventures today?
Well, there's still people who like them. I don't know. Thimbleweed Park was intentionally done to match the style of the games from before, although bringing in more of a modern aesthetic to it. I'm not a huge game player myself, so I haven't played some of the modern ones that came out that were really popular. They're kind of on my list when I get a chance. I think that it's gonna continue. I mean, you hear stories always like, graphic adventures, point and click adventures are dead, and then someone comes out with a new one or a new twist on one, and it's popular and people like it. So I think they're here to stay. They don't have to be point and click with a SCUM interface. But the concept of having an adventure where you're solving puzzles and talking to other characters, I think that's here to stay. I'm been looking at a lot at virtual reality, and am very interested in seeing whether a style of graphic adventure can make it over to virtual reality in a way where it works. Mm-hmm. One aspect is that usually adventure games are third person, so you see your characters on the screen. In VR, that might be more difficult, although there's some that have kind of achieved that. There's a game I like called Moss in VR, which isn't quite a graphic adventure game, but you do have a third person character that you're controlling, and there are some puzzles to solve, and I think it's a nice mix. So I think there's ways to make that happen.
Okay, so the final question, David, and you've already answered parts of it. As a family man, do you still find time to play today? And if so, what games do you enjoy?
Yeah, not a huge amount. And when I do play a game right now, it's probably going to be a VR game, because I have a whole bunch that I purchased and downloaded, and I've played maybe 5% of them. And so I have a huge backlog. I've been doing some other work, helping Gary with a project, prototype, unannounced, just something we're playing with, some ideas.
Okay.
And yeah, and where have other stuff I'm working on that has nothing to do with games. I'm a electric car enthusiast, and see the transition to electric cars is a hugely important thing. In our county, emissions from gas cars make up about 50%, 55% of the CO2 emissions or the greenhouse gas emissions in our county. And so having more people switch is going to make a big impact. And the other thing I wanted to announce or mention is that I'm going to be speaking in Poland in May. Mm-hmm. There's a conference called Pixel Heaven Fest on, I guess it's the 19th. Yeah, I think it's the 19th and 20th, or 18th and 19th. 18th and 19th in Warsaw. And I'm also going to be in Germany in August at DevCom and speaking there. And I think that's probably not announced yet. I don't have specifics, but I know I'm going to be there with Noah, and we're going to be talking about Indiana Jones and Last Crusade. So it's part of the 30th anniversary tour.
Great.
In fact, that's also true for Pixel, for the one in Warsaw, for Pixel Heaven Fest. So there's a chance for people in Germany to say hello if they happen to be there.
David, thank you so very much for taking the time for this interview. I really enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for creating some of my all-time favorite video games.
You're very welcome. I enjoyed our talk.
Thank you. Bye, David.
Okay, bye-bye.